can have the best model in the world. However, if it doesn't have access to the right data at the right time, it's not going to be able to achieve what it's to. You can't win that championship without a great car. Is in a way forcing this real-time unified data model so that the use cases can deliver the value that we really need them to deliver.
Welcome back to Conversation and Insights. I'm Efe Pilarino, and today we will be exploring one of the most consequential shifts happening in financial services and in general cross industry, and that is AI, Gen AI, agentic AI. And Gartner says that agentic AI is already #1 strategic technology trend. It was in 25, it remains in 26. Financial services are projected to spend $97 billion by 2027 in AI. Jamie Dimon at the WEF, he spent $2 billion in AI already, that's his bet. And he's boldly saying that it affects everything: risk, fraud, marketing, idea generation, customer service, and that's the tip of the iceberg. But it's not all rosy and easy. There's a tension here. And Gartner summarizes it really nicely by saying that on the one hand, 40% of enterprise apps will include task-specific AI agents by the end of this year, but yet 40% of agentic AI projects will be canceled by the end of 27. With my guest today, we're going to dive in a conversation discussing these nuances, the opportunities, the challenges from a field experience. Tim, welcome.
Thanks, Efe. Nice to be here.
Yeah, Tim Brophy is Principal Solution Architect at Elastic, where he works with financial institutions on search, on observability, on AI. Elastic is a European-born company, global, listed on NYSE, and Tim comes fresh from an Elastic roundtable in Paris, focused on financial services. So we have a lot to talk about and pick your mind, Tim. Let's start with one of your very sharp metaphors or analogies that I love. You say that the model is more important or is less important, and the data is the secret sauce. And you use a race car analogy. Let's unpack that because it helps us understand why it is that AI is forcing now the issue of the data secret source, especially in financial services.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's obviously a huge amount of development on the model side of things. These organizations, these companies that are building large language models they're doing things that 2-3 years ago were not even thought possible, even by me, who was like an early adopter and really impressed by the technology early on. But what we're not seeing, in my view, is the kind of mature adoption inside of organizations. And the challenge is that these models, once they're trained, the data that they have is already historical. It's also based mostly on public information, and it's not based on your information as an organization, as an FSI. So in order to implement these models, it's really important that they get access to the right information at the right time. So for example, if you wanted to have a chatbot that was answering questions around, let's say, employee experience, like what is my HR policy? That HR assistant or that agentic or conversational interface would need to have information about where I'm based, who I am, what's the policy in my region. It can't just use trained information and give me an answer because it's probably going to direct me down the wrong path. And in this way, I compare it to Formula One in the analogy in that all of these racing drivers have pretty much been the best in their field, and there's parity between most of them. Of course, there are outliers, but there's parity in terms of their skills and what they can do in a car across the grid. The challenge and the difference that we see it year after year is the car, it's the platform. And I see that as the LLM there's parity across these LLMs. Yes, there are differences and each have different skills in certain areas, but without the right data platform, they're not able to deliver the value that we want from our AI use cases inside of our organization. So I liken that comparison, because you can have the best model in the world, excuse me, you can have the best model in the world. However, if it doesn't have access to the right data at the right time, it's not going to be able to achieve what it needs to.
So if you don't have a great car in Formula One.
Yeah, you can't win that championship without a great car.
So you're talking about the data from the strategic data from the business, right? Whether it's transaction data in retail banking or other types of data in wealth management, in capital markets, it's that type of data. And it's all about, is it about finally unifying that data in some way? And what we've done up until now is not enough. The data lakes or whatever we have done up to date doesn't prepare the organization for AI.
Yeah, or it results in an AI implementation which just fails to meet the demands, because the data oftentimes is in separate silos, and logically, let's say as data owners or system owners, business owners inside of an organization, an FSI organization, we look and go, that's the data for my use case. That makes sense. What we don't often take into account is context is key. And you may have my transactions. Do you have my obligations and my loans? Do you have my investments and my long-term savings? That creates a picture. Of course, we call it know your customer. However, if for an agentic implementation to deliver the answer in the right way, it needs access to all of these things, including policies, guidelines, and rules and regulations. And you don't want to bubble that all up into one call to a large language model and overload it with information. You actually need the pinpoint accuracy on your search results to create the context that that large language model, that generative AI model, can deliver the answer that it needs. And the problem is, when the data exists in these silos, it's a very complex chain to bring it all together. And we have had solutions where we've unified or centralized data, put that in a big data lake or a big warehouse. Oftentimes that's potentially yesterday's data, or even if it's today's data and it's real time, the schemas are often very complicated and different, because this unified data model in many organizations doesn't fully exist or hasn't been fully, let's say, aligned to. So it might be an idea, or it might be something that's in progress, but really the reality is the developer writing the experience is constrained by the different schemas that the data generates. So it's become a real challenge. And I think that AI is, in a way, forcing this real-time unified data model so that the use cases can deliver the value that we really need them to deliver.
Great points. The real-time need for agentic AI is really forcing this to the next level. Tim, you were at this Elastic Roundtable in Paris. It was financial services focused. What did you take away from that event? What is your sentiment from talking to these institutions, concerns, opportunities, challenges, the differences? Can you share with us a little bit from that? Because things change, strategies change these days. They're not set annually and forgotten. Everything is changing. It's not only technology.
Right, exactly. It was a really good event. I think it was interesting to see that no one denies that AI is the most prevalent and important thing on the roadmap. The question is, depending on where you sit in the organization, the question is really, how does this affect me and my team, or how I achieve what I need to achieve for the next financial year? I've noticed a trend where there are, firstly, the context is that Elastic is used for different things. It's not one platform for one thing. It's one platform for general data unification and search, right? So we We speak to operational teams that are responsible for system availability and uptime for our observability solution, security teams, and teams that are producing search interfaces and search use cases and experiences on their application. So we have a broad audience, which means it's really interesting to see who's thinking differently based on where they sit. So if I'm operational and my use case may be I want an AI assistant to help me troubleshoot an issue and get to resolution faster. There is I would say typically in these larger, highly governed organizations like FSI, an AI or transformation unit or practice centrally that's making decisions about how AI is implemented in the organization. And these are two worlds that are very far apart sometimes, because the transformation is often either thinking about use cases like customer support or transformative user experiences on the product side or employee experience. But the reality is that the needs are different between these organizations. So I see that as being a bit of a friction point. It's almost like, I want to do this. I want to move forward with this project. This team hasn't approved this model for this use case, or I'm not allowed to access this model in this way. We have a customer who has exactly that challenge. The team wants to use a generative AI to achieve an outcome, but there's a defined way that they're allowed to access models, and not all tools will support that way. So it's these fine-grained decision points and the minutiae or the details in this kind of like these finer minutiae points. And that is what we see bubble up to the surface. And it depends very much on where you sit. I definitely did see a real enthusiasm and more readiness on the side of the teams who are building customer-facing experiences like pure search experiences. Now, your ideal result is not a list of products anymore or a list of transactions. It's a conversational suggestion about what the best product for your use case is, or for what you're asking, the best results. So there's more externally, like the customer-focused side or the search-orientated side of these businesses are quite positive. Operational teams that could benefit a lot from these use cases are positive, but they're not always given the tools necessarily that they want to use.
So if we think of the three traditional layers of back office, middle office, front office, for now you're observing that there's more readiness or more in production in the front office, and there's more challenges in the back and middle office.
Yes, but I actually want to not walk back anything, but I would say that around FSI, the risk of front office AI deployments is so high that I'm almost seeing that front office. I would replace front office with more search use cases, which are more, they're either going to be consumed internally as employee experience, or on front office, there'll be customer support, but there'll be low stakes front office, right? If I ask a question about how do I apply for a mortgage, and it gives me a slightly wrong answer, the stakes are quite low, as opposed to I ask a question that shows me my neighbor's transactions. So we're seeing more low stakes implementations, but there is definitely more readiness on those teams to adopt AI.
Maybe we can talk about a specific example. I know you've mentioned to me that one of the major European born bank that is one of the top innovative incumbents, serving 80 million retail customers across 25 countries. They have had a different way and insight in leveraging elastic technology to address this unified data foundation challenge. Can you walk us through what they did, how they leveraged your data capabilities, with what kind of data, and what did they create that really helped them position themselves?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's really a story of positioning themselves to be on the springboard for future innovation around this, because what they decided to do was essentially say the mainframe, or let's call it doesn't have to be a mainframe, could just be a system of record, is an expensive platform to query for analytics. And it's also not necessarily, analytics and search is not the overriding reason for those platforms. Those platforms are designed to be resilient and stable and robust and store our transaction records, right? So what they did is that they implemented Elasticsearch in the way that we would implement Elasticsearch, which is a distributed horizontally scaling cluster. And they brought 20 years of legacy transactions, and they put them onto Elasticsearch. And they ingested that, and then it became the home of a real-time replica of what was happening on the sort of system of record, shipping onto Elasticsearch. So it's a real-time replication of that, not for the purposes of disaster recovery, but more for purposes of easier and more controlled granular access to that data. And what they did is they took that and used our search platform to provide a more intuitive, a far more performant, less costly, because when you query the mainframe, every single query is a cost. Not only that, every time you query the mainframe, there's resources which are now not available for processing. So it was just a far more architecturally best practice implementation to take all those transactions, put them into our unified search AI lake, and then build really intuitive customer experiences that were producing search results on transaction histories, which were spanning, in this case, decades, and being able to do a lot more fine-grained filtering on their data. And we also, this is very unique for Elastic because we are a search engine, we have the notion of relevance. So if you're asking a question, be it in natural language or just keyword searching, when you ask a question, we always return the most relevant answer. And then developers can slice and dice based on how they want to use that. But we have this identifier of how relevant the record is to the question that was asked. And that is really powerful because that enables the next AI use case to leverage or to pick only the top, let's say, 5 results of a query and generate an answer based on those highly relevant results that have been returned. Let me not compare other platforms, but as an experience, my experience as a developer, is that in different situations, I have to then sort and order those queries and the results of those queries by some metric. And then when building generative AI experiences, I might have to choose a long list of data, let's say in this case, transactions, to send to a conversational interface for interpretation. With Elasticsearch, we know that you just need to cherry pick the most relevant results to drive the right outcome. So that improves agent accuracy, customer satisfaction, and it all begins by unifying that data into one accessible lake. And accessible doesn't mean devoid of a role-based access control, fine-grained controls over fields that are visible versus are not visible, or obfuscated and redacted fields, for example. We have the capability to do all of those things. So it's just more accessible in the sense of organizationally easier to access.
Plus what you're saying, the cost, which is really becoming an issue, a major issue for all organizations.
Exactly.
Tim, when we were talking earlier, we were chatting about these big banks that are processing huge volumes of payments, and inevitably they have big groups of people that are processing these failed payments. Is this a Gen AI or an agentic AI case to be solved? I think that understanding what's the best solution, because we are all obsessed with conversational interfaces, but do we understand where it's better to have a conversational interface versus agentic AI? What are the differences? Are we confused, especially in FSI, whether it's for the employees or for the customers? Can you talk to us about this?
Yes, I think clearinghouses are dealing with huge volumes of payments, which require, oftentimes there's a failure or rejection, and that requires human intervention to resolve. And we think of LLMs in the context of ChatGPT or Gemini, where we're speaking to a model and we're getting answers. And that is, I think, the predominant use case. But there are, let's call them transparent or embedded implementations of these LLMs where we can build workflows. They don't have to be super sophisticated. They can be quite simple. And we can say, for example, this payment has failed. We can channel it to a queue. This is the payment. This is the specification or the format that we're expecting. Is there an alignment or a mismatch? And the LLM can identify that very easily because that is what they do. Pattern recognition is essentially what they're built to do, and determining the next step based on what has come from before. And they can either flag that up to a human agent to correct, or maybe even leverage existing known information in a knowledge base and correct that payment or that document and again send it on. I think that the specifics of the use case probably in the realm of where I'm sitting, probably not appropriate for me to even try and map out the whole workflow. But if I look at what an LLM is designed to do, and you've mentioned earlier on that Jamie Dimon's invested a huge amount and sees AI as applicable to everything, even payments. It seems like workflow and business processing is a natural place to put agents or agentic AI implementations. And let's talk about the difference between purely conversational and then agentic AI. In the agentic side, we don't have to interact as humans with the AI in terms of providing prompts in the moment. We can actually provide those prompts as part of a workflow. And that's really quite fascinating to see the outcomes of these workflows. So we'll have a workflow that will send a business process or an artifact into a business process, prompt an AI to generate some kind of outcome. Based on that outcome, we'll make a next step and follow that through. And payments and payment resolution is, I think, one of those easy embedded use cases to imagine. But there are many. And I think that the big thing that sort of speaks to me is that's not about necessarily removing a desk of analysts that are resolving these payments. It's about improving their product efficiency or productivity so that they can do other things and look monetization of this data as well. Because I think this is also with the new ISO challenges in payments and this new formatting is that banks have to monetize because it's an explosion of data. Banks need to do more with that information. And that I think has been the guidance in the past. And hopefully this is a mechanism that we can do that without huge investment because we can offload a lot of the process-driven tasks to LLMs.
So really you're saying what I'm hearing is that all this preparation to the unified data foundation and whatever else one does to prepare for AI will also unlock new opportunities around data monetization, around open banking potentially. And this is something that we haven't even scratched the surface yet, right?
Yeah, and I would also jump in and say potentially risk reduction because everybody thinks like going back to the roundtable, there's Phil probably didn't mention it, but there's obviously concerns around risk of AI. AI could be hugely beneficial in the world of risk reduction. And that is because, again, let's talk about the unified data environment. If I'm sending payments through a payment gateway and let's say I'm doing all sorts of strange, accepting big payments and sending micro payments all over the world and doing like many of these things which anti-money laundering and anti-fraud applications pick up on patterns, but they're designed for that one use case. If we unify our data, we can use AI to not only make payment processing more streamlined, but to instantaneously pick up when there are issues, rather than when these kind of like patterns emerge from the data after huge volumes of data. We can start to see it in real time. And I think that risk reduction is also potentially a huge area of embedded AI enablement.
Yeah, I imagine. And when we get to the point where even supervisory bodies can access these technologies and they can do a better job on this front. Tim, when you help organizations with implementing agentic AI in workflows and business processes, there's a big challenge here because we don't have standards for agents yet. And who knows how long it will take if we go by our history of developing standards, especially in financial markets. It takes a long time. Maybe it will happen faster here, but there is a challenge. How do you think about it? Because it is a reality. And how do you help organizations?
Yes, it is a challenge. And I think there's also, I'm seeing across geographies there are different forces at play, right? In terms of over-regulation or not, I shouldn't say over-regulation, but like extensive regulation versus no regulation. And there has to be a happy balance in between. But until that happy balance emerges, to your point, what do I do? What does my customer do who doesn't want to get left behind? And in that sense, we encourage treating that business process that includes the LLM or that agentic use case as an auditable, trackable, monitored portion of the system landscape. So you wouldn't run your online banking without audit records and without application performance monitoring and without logging that you retain for years and years. And you have to treat that use case in the same way. And every innovation with generative AI or an LLM and an agentic use case, I would encourage that part of the development process is how are we going to track and monitor and manage. There, advise customers to use evaluation frameworks. That is, if you think about it, it's almost a constant monitor of the interaction between LLMs and end users or business processes and logging what they do and then evaluating those outcomes or the outputs from the LLM against what we know for that particular use case in terms of relevance and accuracy and truthfulness. Let's say if it's conversational search, that these at the moment the framework environment is also constantly changing. It's very difficult. We're always having to stay on top of new developments, but it's more around the standard architectural principles of not only thinking about the use case, not only thinking about the underlying data, also thinking about the evaluation and cost control. This is the other thing, is that cost control is a huge issue because you want to know when you are going to blow through your budget long before it happens, not after it's happened. And at the moment,
what
cost
is the
control.
source, obviously, of that? Because it can be
Exactly.
really confusing if you don't have the right tracking, monitoring.
Yeah, especially if it's almost not even broken down at a use case level and you just see from your model provider, this is the bill for the last 3 days. You have to be able to break it down into this is the use case that's consuming all of that. So there are many, it's more of a developing framework. And then also there are emerging communication protocols and standards that are becoming, in a way, de facto. MCP, the Model Context Protocol, is one of these things where you essentially gateway a model's access to tools inside of your platform. So, for example, with Elastic, we've deployed our own MCP capability inside of the Elasticsearch platform, and you can write predefined queries that maybe ring fence the data that the model can get access to, provides much faster access to certain data points through filtering, could even allow that model to kick off a workflow. But if you are containing it in that MCP framework, the model does not have free reign, and your developer is not having to think about every single iteration or possibility of what data the model would need to have access to. So those kinds of standardizations that are emerging are more efficient, they're more governable or easier to manage. And we are getting closer, I think.
So there is improvement, great improvement, even though it's not, we haven't arrived to where we want to be, but the industry is moving and recognizing that we need all these tools and evaluation frameworks and standardization.
Yes, I would say that they're orientated more towards functionality than governance, but I think this is the role of standards bodies to come up with these kinds of things, which are maybe not as exciting as enabling the next sort of revolution.
Yeah, but we all know that we're at a stage where the boring things are the ones that are important, be it around standards, be it around governance. All these things are becoming very important because we're at the stage of real implementation. Tim, we could be talking for hours. I want to close our discussion asking you maybe a personal question as a consumer, as a user, but also with your Elastic professional hat. What are the questions that are open about AI in your mind? For example, are you a believer? Are you concerned about agentic payments, the shift of everything on maybe collapse of apps and everything shifting on OpenAI, whatever one of these text or prompting or voice to text interfaces? What else is on your mind, kind of either as a radar, a concern, and as I said, both with both hats? Just to
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a diplomat, but at this point in time, it's who knows. I have, I suppose, personal concerns more around the responsible usage of AI. I think it was Yuval Noah Harari at WEF last week said it was the perfect, like, I'm a big fan, right? So I've read all of his books, and I think the way he puts things, ideas into words is really powerful. But a knife is a tool. An agent is a knife that knows what to cut and how to cut. And I think that when we start to implement these agentic AI use cases in any organization, think small. Like, I think this is the overriding message that I give to a lot of customers, is really think small for now. Not think small in the sense of ultimate ambitions and what AI can do, because I think that it's almost impossible to know the limits really at this point. But think small about your use case, to have governance and control, and to have it implemented responsibly. I see, and this is genuinely like, even I think about it personally as well. I see in hackathons and in conference presentations big ideas where autonomous infrastructure management is really possible with AI, and our current LLM capabilities with agentic workflows and MCP tooling. The possibility of that, however, being implemented in our constrained legacy, highly regulated environment is pretty small. So it can then almost be quite demoralizing to go, I have this idea where we could basically not have to ever worry about scaling and outages, and we could have this environment self-heal itself. And these are all possible. But the reality is, for now, at this point in time, we just need the assistant to tell us, what does this error message mean? So we need to bring it down to reality. And I think that in all instances, it's really important to do that when we speak about LLMs. Yeah, and I think that's going to help. It's going to help in responsible implementation. It's going to help in actual real value delivery. And then let's adopt the way that we've been developing applications for the last 20 years, which is in this agile incremental improvement mechanism, where it's think this is what I can do in this small period of time, or the sprint. Then we're going to iterate, and we're going to improve, and we're going to keep going. We're going to keep A/B testing. And I think this, maybe I haven't heard it really being spoke about a lot, but I've thought about this in especially engaging with a lot of operational people who have not been developers. Everyone is having to think about small implementations and incremental improvements and iterating on these ideas. We all have to start thinking like agile developers, even though it seems like none of us are going to be developers anymore because the LLMs are going to write all the code for us anyway. But we need to think about the way we implement these projects in small baby steps and incremental improvements.
And as you said, I'm hearing from you that we all have to zoom out and look at the big potential and how a bit futuristic, how the world can change, but really zoom into and see, ground ourselves and see what we're going to do next, how we're going to change slightly the way we work and really adapt, slowly learn, feedback loops. I like to say that the last 20 years of digital transformation has definitely improved the feedback loops through data, APIs, and all these other changes. But here we're talking about another level of complexity, tackling that through technologies, but we need to make it in a way that is secure, we can monitor it, we can control it, and it's auditable.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's absolutely critical. That's a good way to sum it up.
Tim, thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Effie. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.